Hey, Tony.
Hey Larry, how you doing?
Good. Yourself?
Oh, not bad. Enjoying the sunny day we're having out here.
Yeah.
Lots of sun.
Good. Right.
Let's make things over here. Let's see. It's on silent.
Recording. We want to thank Jonathan for joining us today. We'll do a quick club business, and then we'll have Tony introduce Jonathan, and we'll get going. And in the interim, as we usually do, let's have everybody on mute and either use the chat to submit questions as the presentation's going on, or towards the end of the presentation, we'll open it up for everybody to converse with Jonathan. We're looking forward to getting some more events going. We're reaching out to Fremer, who's got a new job evidently at TAS, and Andrew Jones is now with MoFi, so we're going to try to get a hold of him. And we are scheduling a lab visit with John Curl once he gets some of his equipment repaired. So that'll be fun, I think. And we'll have some more educational events coming up. As probably a lot of you saw, we're also working on transitioning to the new website. So we've had some hiccups there, but reach out to me if you have any questions about that. So anyway, looking forward to this. I think this will be a fun event and interesting. So Tony, introduce Jonathan.
Sure. Today, I'm proud to speak to our group, Jonathan Horwich. Jonathan is the owner of International Phonograph Inc, or IPI. And just by a little history, I don't know exactly when it was I first ran into Jonathan and his company. I somehow remember maybe a thread I read somewhere where maybe Miles Astor posted about it. But I kind of went through my collection of Jonathan's recordings, and I've got no less than 60 of them. So I must have known him for quite a few years yet now, because he doesn't put out that many recordings in a year. But in any event, Jonathan is a recording engineer. Again, his company is IPI, and he's based in Chicago. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the art of recording. He has an article I think he wrote on June 3rd for the Absolute Sound. We'll talk a little bit about that article. Anyway, I present to you Jonathan Horwich. So Jonathan, I'm sure there are probably some folks on the line who might know about you, either through the email that we sent out or maybe just in their audio file research or knowledge. But maybe you can take a little bit of time to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Goodness, where to start? When I start, I think the pivotal point in my life regarding all of this was when I heard a album by Charles Mingus called Tijuana Moods. And that is where I got hooked on jazz, which has led to everything else. And I had a deep love of jazz in early college years. And I was lucky enough to be at the same school as an expert on jazz who had an incredible ear and trained me in listening to jazz for about 2 years or a year. And then he had the idea to start a record company, which we did back then. This is way back in the early 60s. And that really was the beginning of it. And although I wasn't an audiophile, I had that sort of spark in me for good sound. And so we bought some decent equipment. I didn't know about microphones then, but we bought a good tape recorder, a Scully 4-track, which is basically like an Ampex 4-track. And that was really the beginning of it. We started recording musicians in LA, and one thing led to another, and on and on and on. And I came in contact with a person who worked for, in later years, that was strictly the period of my life of the 60s and early 70s, mid 70s, was pretty well strictly a jazz orientation, not an audiophile thing. But then I got involved with Mark Levinson's company because they were making a Studer A80 modification, which improved the Studer A80. And I bought some for clients. I was consulting some clients, and we bought them, and I got to know better sound than the normal stock. And that sort of led me into the audiophile world. And I started International Phonograph Incorporated in 1978 with a recording of a pianist called Richie Beirach. And one thing led to another, and we carried on. And then I think it was but I was still oriented toward jazz. I was putting out jazz on CD that had never been put out on CD. And then around 2010, I think it was, people started asking, why don't you put out some of your master tapes on tape? And I never even thought of that. And I started thinking about it, and I finally did in 2012. I started putting out some of my master tapes, and then I started recording fresh material on modern equipment, which sounded a lot better than the old stuff that I have, or at least a lot of it. And one thing led to another, and here I am, 10 years later, still doing tape.
Great. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say the response to the tape was immediate, by customers. So I carried on.
Well, I'm glad you did. I think probably when you mentioned 2012, probably that was about the time. That's when I first got my Otari deck, and I had it modified to take the signal direct off the tape heads, and had a preamp built for me by a well-known manufacturer, Ralph Karsten at Atmosphere, that he incorporated the 15 IPS EQ into. So I think it was probably 2012, maybe a little later, maybe 2013 or so, but I guess about 9-10 years ago. So that would explain all the tapes. Okay, fair enough. The question I have now is, you mentioned, you were trained by a fellow student who was an expert in jazz in terms of listening. What did you find that you needed to learn in order to become an engineer? I mean, what was that process like? Obviously, it involves some knowledge of electronics and use of electronics in the recording process. I mean, how did that come about?
Okay. First of all, that person who trained me was a professor. He was a writer for Downbeat. So he had years of experience. He was brilliant. And without him, I don't know if I ever would have developed the ear I did in terms of jazz itself. So that's just that. In terms of the recording, I knew nothing about electronics, and really to this day know very little that's worthy of any kind of technical knowledge. But what happened was I just started recording, and by necessity, I just sort of learned as I went, just like anything else where you really have to learn. And I learned this and that as I went along. And, I'm still learning. I don't consider myself a total expert. I think I have something to contribute, but my knowledge is growing all the time. So it was a long period of learning. When I first started out with the audiophile thing in 1978, I was recording with only 2 microphones because of the purist view that 2 mics is the most natural sound, which it is. Very difficult to do, though, very difficult. I've got maybe 1 or 2 recordings I did with 2 microphones that I think are astounding. And so then recently, when 2012 or 13, I switched to an 8-track Studer.
You guys got a light.
Pardon me? Oh, I thought somebody said something.
Keep going.
So it was just a matter of learning as I went. The one thing I always had in mind, though, was to keep things to a minimum. Keep the microphones to a minimum, keep the equipment to a minimum. Not because I couldn't carry it then, but because I knew the more complex you got, the less the quality. The ideal recording is made with 2 microphones. You cannot beat it. But when you get multiple instruments, it becomes very difficult to cover them with just 2 microphones. But I always keep things to a minimum. I use 4 to 6 to 8 mics at the most now. But to answer your question, it was just a matter of me recording over the years and learning. And part of that learning is the equipment that I like the sound of, which is very important. That takes forever to discover. As you all know, you order an amplifier and you don't like it, you got a real problem because you just bought it and the value of it has gone down instantaneously and you're stuck with a $10,000 piece of gear. And what do? And that makes the process very slow in recording.
I guess in terms of, your work over the years, in terms of other recording engineers or other people that you've worked with, I mean, do you have anybody that, you kind of have a favorite or some engineers that you have some respect for that you care to mention and talk about?
Yeah, well, first of all, historically, Ray Donan is one of the greatest ever. It's just Way Out West with Sonny Rollins is a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece of music too. But he was incredible. And of course, Rudy Van Gelder. More recently, Jim Anderson, who does all of Patricia Barber stuff, is brilliant. There are a handful of brilliant recording engineers. I can't remember the name of the guy who did, can't remember it. I have to look it up. But he's brilliant. He's right to 2-track. He records to 2-track. He did, God, I can't remember the name of it. Let me see if I can remember it. Let me just take a look here. What is that? Oh boy, can't remember it. Anyway, there are some modern engineers who are quite good, and one of them is here in the Chicago area. Is Anthony Gravino, who does some of my stuff. Some of the tapes I've done are by him that I put out. Like one of the ones that Miles loved was by Anthony. He's an incredible engineer, and he's got, I don't know, does everybody know what reverb is?
I do.
Okay, well, reverb, it's in that article I wrote for Absolute Sound. Reverb is basically an echo you add to the sound, to the recording to make it sound like it has space around it. Even though it was recorded in a dry studio, you add reverb and it gives it a bigger sound, and it has some very great advantages, which is it sort of glues everything together so they sound like they're all playing in the same space. It doesn't sound like a natural space, but it sounds like a space nonetheless, instead of like what sounded like in the studio, which would not necessarily be attractive. And it also covers up flaws in microphones. For instance, I have a recording that Anthony did, and I didn't like the sound of one of the mics. And I had reverb, luckily, and I put reverb on it, which was supposed to be on it anyway, and it just smoothed it right over. That's not my particular style, but reverb has a great advantage. The problem with reverb, one of the problems is most reverb is terrible sounding, but there's one that's called an EMT 124 way back from, 50 years ago or whatever it is now. That's incredible. And he uses that and it's just gorgeous. It really is beautiful. And he's my favorite current engineer. And he's done several discs for me, several tapes for me.
I want to kind of get into the article a little bit. I found it pretty fascinating, and a lot of great points that you make in it. And I just, right off the top, the first, sentence, talking about the artistic decisions that need to be made in the entire process between, the engineer, producer, and then talking about the workable, devices to achieve that goal. I guess from the aspect of collaboration, can you talk about that a little bit? The process of working, obviously as an engineer and producer, and then the artists themselves. I mean, how's that process roll out? How's that work for you?
Well, in my case, I'm lucky, now the way I'm doing it, people sort of, the musicians I work with, I'm really producing it. I'm really a jazz producer at heart, and I'm a recording engineer second to that. And I'm lucky in that when I call a musician to do this recording, the basis of it and how I do it is sort of part of the package, so that I'm not really having to interface or collaborate too much, other than with the musicians when they listen back. When we first do the first take, we have them come in and listen, and they might say, oh, like last recording I did, which is one of my best ones ever, the bassist says, gee, that doesn't quite sound like my bass. And I said, you're right, there's something funny. And I moved the microphone up too high and I moved it back down, and it was perfect after that. That kind of collaboration I do all the time. But in terms of with a producer, it's very minimal because I am the producer. And when I do work with another producer, I have to find out what his likes and dislikes are. And I respect those. Everything can't be the way I want it. It's the way I want it when I do it myself, and that's fine. But when I'm working with somebody else, I respect their desire. For instance, I was thinking of doing a recording of Patricia Barber to analog tape, which I thought would be exciting because all her recordings are digital. But her first requirement is that Jim Anderson do them, and he's a fabulous recording engineer. So I had to coordinate with Jim Anderson. This was in the last 6 months. And I coordinated with Jim Anderson, and the way he wants to record and the way she does would not lend itself to what I do. And we had to quit the whole thing. So there's sometimes when you just can't do it the way you want to do it. I can't remember what the bug was, but it was major. The way she wants, first of all, she wants reverb on her voice, which I don't normally do. If you've heard my D. Alexander, there's nothing on her voice.
Right, I have
one of my tapes. That's just raw, what it is. So when you work with somebody else, there's a give and take, unless you're the producer and the people are signing on with the understanding that the way I do it is the way I do it. And because I'm doing tape to tape, it really doesn't interfere with them in any way, because they can take the digital backup of the tape I do, and they can manipulate it and do whatever they want with it for their own use. So it's sort of, I got a good balance there. I'm very lucky that way.
Yeah, I remember you did those Patricia Barber tapes from the Digital Masters. Is that right? You put out a number of them. Yeah, I think I have all of them, but I think there are 5 of them or 4 or 5 of them that you put out with their permission, with Jim and Patricia's permission. Really good quality. I really enjoy them. I do though wish that they could allow you to make an analog. I think that would be a real treat for a lot of people.
Really.
So as the in your model, being that you call up the artists and you are the producer and as well as the engineer, I mean, I guess challenges are minimal then. I mean, do you run into any issues at all? Anything headbutting or just in general artistic differences in terms of how when they come in and listen to the tracks, for example, as you mentioned, I mean, what's typically the feedback or how's the feedback loop get worked and closed?
Well, that's a good question. Usually, first of all, I very rarely get into headbutt. In fact, I don't know when I've gotten in any headbutting, because the battle, how you pick your battles, that's not a battle I need to have. I mean, unless somebody says you can't use microphone, something major, but I've never had that. So headbutting is very rare. And the feedback from the musicians we're listening over an incredible system, you know, as good as mine. Maybe not, I don't know if it's better, but really good. And usually it's like, oh my God. And it really is, it's oh my God to me too, when we listen back. You're listening over, you know, the store I do it at has name equipment, very high quality name. And these ProX speakers that are just, if I had cone speakers, I would buy those in 2 seconds. They're floor standing, about 4 feet tall, and they're like, oh my God, they're like electrostatic. So the sound quality is startling. And we usually get nothing but, oh my God. Artistically, though, once in a while things go off the rails. Like one of my favorite musicians in Chicago, he brought his crew in, and I told him I want to do something just like we did before. And they played literally like Ornette Coleman does. Nothing wrong with that for me. You know, that's nothing to me, but there's no way my customers would have liked it. And I lost the session. I still have the master tapes and I love it, you know, but I don't think my guys are going to like. So that happens once in a while. And I know to be careful, try to be careful. Greg Ward is on the edge of that. Greg Ward is a brilliant Chicago saxophonist who's on the avant edge of straight ahead jazz. And he's brilliant, but I have to watch it with him too. But he, you know, usually stays within bounds of my customers' taste.
Okay, I mean, I think that was kind of the what I wanted to hear out of that answer. I was always kind of interested in, you know, how those interactions work in the studio, and you know, who has, you know, the final control, who has the final say. Obviously, someone has to finally make a decision. You know, so.
Well, the producer usually does, you know, but I never have the problem. But like I was doing a recording with somebody, I won't mention the name. And he brought in a saxophone player who I didn't think was really great. The guy was okay. And we have some great sax players in Chicago, like John Wojciechowski. And so in the middle, after the session was over, I recommend to the musicians, okay, let's try it now for variation with just 3 instruments, not the sax, just so I have some variation. They went, oh, okay. And they did 2 pieces. And those 2 pieces are the main pieces on the tape, because the saxophonist wasn't very good. So I sometimes do intervene, but I do it in a way that's not intrusive, you know, but that saved the session, frankly.
And I know this might take a while to answer, but maybe you can break it down a little bit. When you obviously get somebody to come in and you want to start recording them, do you have a specific process, a methodology, or a way that you like to work and manage the recording process, you know, from the producer's perspective? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, if that exists in your environment.
It does. You mean the mechanics of how I sort of set it up? And
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. What I love to do is set up the day before, so everything's on and ready. So we aren't, like, once in a while you'll go, where's that microphone? The microphone's not working. You find out a cable's plugged in the wrong thing or something's wrong. You don't want to be doing that in front of musicians. I don't. So I set up the night before with my at the store with the store owner, Ken Christensen, and we set everything up and make sure everything's working perfectly. Then I leave the equipment on overnight. And then when the musicians come, I tell them, practice whatever you want, but try to play the loudest thing you're going to play. And then we let them play, and we get set all the settings and get it 99% set while they're practicing. So there's really no interference or intrusion to the musicians. And that's the basic thing I try to do. And if something doesn't sound right, we might switch a microphone or something there, but it gives us a little leeway. That's the basic setup.
Okay. And then what about the process itself when they're in there and they're starting to play and you're taking down the tracks and that whole process going forward? I noticed on some of the recordings, I don't know if that's you calling it out, but you're calling out the track or the, you know, track 2, take 1 or something like that. I usually hear somebody calling that out, or because the recordings are very clear on my system, and it's great. You can hear a lot of detail, including some of the banter going on between the musicians while they're playing. So more curious too about how you work to record the actual track itself and to get to the final take that ends up on the tape.
Okay, well, first of all, we luckily don't have a lot of takes because they're professional musicians. But the only thing I'll do, usually they've got a set amount of songs. They know they have to cover give me about 35 to 40 minutes of music so I can maneuver the pieces around. So they know that, and they have the pieces picked. And normally there's not much for me to do. They might ask me, what did you think of that? And I'd say it's fabulous, or do one more just in case. And sometimes they'll think we need to do another one. I'll say, no, you don't. That was fabulous. Don't touch it. I will feedback like that to them. But normally they just, especially because I've been using Joe Policastro, and I'm letting him sort of run the session musically. And they will ask me, though, he will, and they will ask me, what did I think? And I'll tell them. But normally it's just one or two takes and they're done.
Cool. It comes across that way. Yeah, it comes across that way in a number of tapes. So I kind of like that aspect. It's a very, obviously, as you said, they're professional, they're well rehearsed, they know what they're going to play, and it's pretty clear. It's a really spontaneous, process. It sounds very live and very lively in a sense. One thing I was always curious about, and maybe you can answer this, and it somewhat applies to what you're doing, and somewhat applies, I think, to back when tapes were really popular and they were being recorded in bulk, and now they're making a comeback. Tape machines are making a comeback. Tape head preamps. People are putting out licensing masters and putting out new old recordings. You have a couple different options sometimes when you make your tapes available, and one of those options is a direct from the master, and another option is usually the production. Right. Obviously, you have a master copy of the tape, so maybe explain to the folks the differences between the three types of tapes that exist in the process.
You mean the difference between a direct and a production copy?
Well, yeah, you have the master and what that encompasses, and then yes, the direct and then the production. Correct.
Okay. Well, the real choice is if you have a master which is in good shape, a true master that recorded the music, and it's in good shape, and especially in modern, I always try to make that available and use that. You can't get better sound than making a copy right off a master. The problem is with older masters, they're falling apart. So trying to run 30, 40, 50, 60 copies, you're taking a risk. Now, I always mainly am using masters that are current when I do direct copies, and I use the older tapes, like the Chick Corea I put out. The Chick Corea with Gary Peacock. I made 2 direct copies off the master, and then from those direct copies, I'm making copies for my customers because I don't want to wear out or damage the master in that case. So that's really largely the choice, is that. When I make my own masters, like we were talking about, then it's no problem. I'll run it 50, 60 times and there's no deterioration. You can't tell the difference between the first copy and the 70th.
What about, I guess, the differences between, say, a 15 IPS recording and maybe now you're starting to hear more about 30 IPS? Ironically, and I think it was on one of your emails that you had referred folks to an article that talked about the Metaxas and Sins tape decks that are now being produced or manufactured by Costas Metaxas. And I happened to buy one, and it has the 30 IPS setting, but there my understanding is there weren't that many true 30 IPS recordings back in the day as masters. Maybe, and most of my recordings that I have are 15 IPS, or maybe they're, if the one recording I have is that is a 30 IPS, might have been made off a 15 IPS, master or a production master. But what about differences in terms of that, in terms of tape speed and recording it in those various formats?
Okay, good question. So first of all, I did a lot of 30 IPS recordings way back then, back in the 70s. You know, the trouble is that they were done on Ampex 456, which is a type of tape that badly deteriorates and gets sticky, and you have to bake it, and running a lot, it sheds. It's just a nightmare. But I have a lot of 30 IPS masters that I did. A lot of people didn't, but I did. But you're right, most masters are 15 IPS. You didn't ask this, but shockingly, recently, in the last year, I had to do a recording at 7.5 IPS on my good Studer Revox. I thought it was going to be like noticeably worse than 15. It was not. I was shocked at how good it sounded. The only reason I don't record at 7.5 now is because everything's kind of standardized around 15. I don't want to rock the boat. But I was shocked at how good 7.5 sounded. My friend Ken Christensen did all of his jazz recordings on a Nagra at 7.5, and they sound fabulous. So the difference between 15 and 7.5, I'm not sure about anymore. The difference between 15 and 30, I am. The 30, you get a little bit more air, a little more open sound.
Okay. All right, so let's change gears a little bit. You also, in the article, talked about sound. So maybe what we can kind of talk about next, you specifically talked about two different types of sound, natural and created. And you also very nicely outlined some recordings of each by artists. And so we actually have one question that came up in the chat that maybe we can tie into this, but maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion and you can talk a little bit about, you know, natural versus created sound, what they are, and some of the traits that they exhibit, and then tie that back into maybe what some of your favorite artists and albums using both of those types of sound are, and kind of move that in that direction.
Well, the ones in the article are my favorites, by the way, just for the record. I can get the article and read them, but I think everybody has a copy.
And I can also mention a few of them too, so we can go through a few, because there's a couple that I want to note specifically and have you talk about. Okay.
So it can be a tricky concept to get, because let's take an obvious, beautiful recording, Kind of Blue. That is a gorgeous recording. It's just tonally gorgeous. The whole thing is gorgeous, but it's not a natural recording of the musicians in a real space. Although I have to say that it was done in that big Columbia studio, and that contributes to the beautiful sound. But if you look at the musicians, they don't look like they're in a room. Same with Patricia Barber. You listen to Cafe Blue, and you don't go, oh, there's Patricia sitting at a piano in a room. It's just a beautiful sound of her voice, or a beautiful sound of Cannonball Adderley saxophone. And it's, so the difference is one type of recording will reflect the room the musicians were in when it was recorded. You'll hear, you literally go, oh my God, they sound like they're in a room together, which, by the way, a lot of people don't like. So I'm not saying which is better, I'm just saying there's a difference. The other one just sounds gorgeous, like Kind of Blue. But if you go back and listen to Kind of Blue, now that you're aware of this difference, you'll see that it doesn't sound like Cannonball Adderley and John Coltrane, and I guess it's what, Bill Evans and Miles are in a room together. They're in a big space together, a gorgeous space, you know, but it's reverb. Of course, the room too, because they're in that gorgeous Columbia room, really makes it sound beautiful, but you never mistake it for them being in a room. And that's especially true of Patricia Barber and several other recordings. They don't sound like they're in a room together, but they do sound gorgeous. And a lot of people don't like the sound, like the Ken Christensen CDs I quoted there in the article. They're incredible. They're just unbelievably real. A lot of people don't like that. They don't like that there's space around the instrument, that you hear the room sound so much. And I understand that. But that's an example of it. Those Ken Christensen recordings are really good.
You have, yeah, you did mention a number of them. The Bill for the natural sound type quality that you were talking about, the Bill Evans Village Vanguard recordings, a lot of the Mercury Living Presence recordings. I think you specifically called out a Rachmaninoff symphonic dances featuring the Dallas Symphony Orchestra, a couple of Charlie Hayden recordings, one with John Taylor and one with Chris Anderson. You had mentioned were brilliant. And I actually just downloaded those off of Qobuz. They're digital, but I'm going to check them out. And I really like the Charlie Hayden's work. I just also have been listening to his work with Jim Hall. And I also have a couple of his recordings, just he and Keith Jarrett, on piano and he on bass. Really, and those were analog on vinyl. So really, really good recordings. And I appreciate that. And then I think on the created sound, you've talked about Miles. You mentioned Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. You also mentioned Patricia Barber and Kenny Burrell, Midnight Blue, Cannonball Adderley, Something Else. Quite a few of them. A couple of other interesting ones as well. For those of you who haven't seen the article, if you want to check out some of those recordings, as Jonathan mentioned, but there was one recording here. You mentioned it earlier, I believe. Actually, two of them that were mentioned. One was Sonny Rollins, Way Out West.
Yes.
What do you really like about that recording? What makes it for you?
The tonality is brilliant. It's just brilliant. It sounds real. That I couldn't do that in a million years. So, I guess it was the microphones they used. That one sort of almost bridges the two, natural and creative one. And then the other one, I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt. No, it was all just beautiful sound.
And then Hampton Hawes Quartets, all night sessions. That's another one I just downloaded off Qobuz to check out. And I think one of the reasons I was interested in this one, it features Jim Hall on guitar, who I mentioned earlier is on one of Charlie Hayden's recordings. And I really like that recording, how they interact with the guitar and bass. It was really, really phenomenal. And I don't know, the sound in my system, and you kind of know a little bit about my system, but it was just amazing. I just kind of sat there in awe a little bit. I hardly ever sit in the sweet spot in my listening room and listen to my system. I might be off on the side somewhere doing something, or as I'm doing this interview, I'm in my kitchen on my computer. And if I'm on my computer working, I'm listening to what's going on in the living room. But boy, I sat through that whole session in my sweet spot. That was an amazing session. So I'd be very curious about your take on the Hampton Hawes Quartet with Jim Hall on it.
I haven't heard it for a while, but I have to. It's very natural. It's, it has a certain, well, you'll hear it, there's a certain relaxed, natural sound to it that I can't describe. It hasn't been manipulated a lot.
I guess in your career, analog recording has been your expertise. Have you ever done a digital recording?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so you have worked in that field. So maybe talk.
No, not only that. When I'm recording the analog all the time, we're doing a digital recording at the same time.
Okay, so you're making an analog and a digital copy of the recording.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I do digital recordings all the time. Like if I transfer my tapes to digital, I do that. I have a Nagra 6, which is a great digital recorder. I have a way to record to DSD. I used to deal with digital a lot before I got into the tape thing, the recent tape thing.
Okay. Talk a little bit about then the differences of working. You did a little bit in the article, touch upon that. I have a little story I'll share in a little bit, but talk about the differences and how you might approach an analog recording versus a digital recording.
In terms of convenience, you mean? The
convenience would be one. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, convenience would be one.
Okay, in some ways it's the same in terms of like Ken Christensen, my friend who records to digital only now and used to only do analog until he founded Nagra 6 digital recorder. We basically have the same philosophy. He just uses digital and I use analog. The problem with analog is it has much more baggage with it. I have to lug an 8-track tape recorder, separate mic preamps, microphones, cable. It's just a real pain in the and I'm getting older, and so it's getting harder. He goes right into his Nagra 6. It's got the mic preamps. You know, he can go to more than 2 tracks if he needs to. It's just so easy. The Nagra 6, which I have right here, I've got it back behind a shelf. You know, it's the size of a big book. Whereas I don't know if you can see it, my Studer 8-track is like, you know, I carry it on, you know, I have to take it on a hand cart. Like it's you know, so it's everything really is the same except the convenience. The convenience is so much better in digital. And don't get me wrong, I've had thoughts about eventually, you know, switching over to digital just to make it easier for myself. You know, there's going to be a point where I've just done just about everything I can do to tape. You know, I've got a few things I want to do, like I want to do a trumpet quartet, a couple other things, but I'm going to run out. You know, I've done it so many times. I've got enough tapes to sink a ship. So there may be a time, you know, there's going to be a time when I run out.
So speaking of what's behind you there, why don't we talk a little bit about the equipment? You talked earlier about microphones and the use of how you do your miking. Maybe just give us a little visual, you know, you don't have to get up and go over there or point to anything, but just talk about what the equipment is that you use and you know, give us a little idea what's in your studio there.
Tell me if you can see this. You see this thing?
Yep.
Okay. And can you see this?
Yep.
So this is the tape deck I record on live, 8-track. This is an 8-track mixer, and I'll explain that in a minute, but you can see both those. When you record to 8-track, which I do, you have to be able to combine it, or what's called mix it down to 2 tracks, because everything is 2-track, and you know, you guys are not all playing 2-track left right stereo, so you don't have 8 amplifiers and 8 speakers and 8 preamps and all that, so you could play back this 8-track. So it has to be mixed down to 2, a left and a right. And that's what that thing to the left of the tape deck does. I use that. It's made by a company called, well, Manley is known. It's a Manley mixer.
Yep.
And it mixes, and I use it to change the volume and the volume of each instrument and the position of each instrument in the stereo spectrum. And then it goes down to 2 tracks, and that becomes the copy. So when I make a copy for somebody of a direct master, I put it on the 8-track tape recorder, which I've recorded I recorded live. It goes through that machine. You see the 8-track out to left and right to the tape recorder and gets the copy made for the customer. And so that's what those 2 things do. That they're my main instruments for making a recording besides the microphones.
And then, basically in the back there as well, and Larry Denniston and I were talking to you the other day, you've got the Horning speakers, the RAL subs. Is that what you listen to the playback on, basically?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm a sort of a disaffected horn guy, in that I can't get that. First of all, I'm most primarily a quad person, a quad 57 sound. So that ruins everything, as you well know, Tony. But so the speakers to me are the best compromise I've ever heard of a horn and a cone. They're I don't quite get it technically, but they're horn loaded. So they're very fast and very, very, very efficient. You know, you need 12 watts and you're fine. They're very fast, but somehow I got the tonality right. How, I don't know, because it's, you know, there's very few horn speakers I like. Yet I like horn speakers much better than cone speakers, yet they don't sound as good, horn speakers. So in general, so that's why I use those. I just love them. They're the best compromise between a cone and a horn. They're sort of in between. And I need, I'm interested, dynamics response is important to me, how fast the speaker responds to the signal. And I have the subwoofers just because I need to make sure if I have any unwanted or wanted bass things, I have to hear it. So that's why I have the RELs. And behind that, you see the treatment, the acoustic treatment. I don't know if you can see they look like egg crates.
Yep.
I'm not a believer in dulling the sound with room treatment. I'm a believer in evenly distributing the sound. So if your sound's hitting a flat, hard wall, it's going to sound horrible. But if you put proper diffusion on that wall, you won't dull the sound, but you'll spread it out evenly and it'll sound much, much better, well, a lot better. I'm very wary of acoustic treatment that dulls the sound and catches the highs and prevents slap echo. I have not had success with that. It dulls the sound to me. So I use a dispersal so that when it hits, instead of it, making that horrible sound that a blank wall does, it disperses it.
When you use, I don't know the precise measurements of your room. It looks fairly big, but not terribly big. But I've often heard that using diffusion in a smaller room, it doesn't really provide too much benefit. What's your thoughts on that? Because most of us audiophiles here in Northern California don't have the luxury of large rooms. We have smaller rooms and typically have some challenges there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've never heard that, so I don't know.
Okay, fair enough.
I've never heard that. To me, it seems like it would work. And the worst that can happen is if you buy diffusion, proper diffusion, the worst that can happen is you can, like I don't know if can you see that there's a giant canvas over here on the wall, sort of a pink, red.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a Chicago artist that my mother had, and I got that, and it's hanging on the wall. It's a brick wall, so it's sort of, it's slightly preventing slap echo without being obnoxiously absorbent. So you can always do things like that, but I'm very wary of huge absorbent material in a listening room.
I like to hear that myself. So we have a question here relative to microphones. I think would be good to talk about. It's on my list, so let's maybe cover it now. The question is, are there different mics that work better for different purposes, such as for vocal, for brass, wood instruments like strings, bass, etc.? What's your take on that?
Absolutely, yes. Like unequivocally, yes. Certain microphones are just fabulous on certain things. Like I'm going to be doing a trumpet quartet next. And I'm still trying to decide what mic to use on the trumpet, because the trumpet can sound a little blary on certain mics, where on other things the mic would sound great. So the answer to that is absolutely. Like the microphones I've talked about before, these Neumann 254s I have are fabulous for strings, classical strings. And I have these modern custom tube mics that are made for me that are fantastic on strings. So there are certain mics that are just really great for certain purposes, yes.
Tube or solid state?
Pardon me?
Do you prefer tube or solid state, or both?
Both.
Okay, so use a combination of both.
Yes, both.
What about your personal system? I mean, we talked a little bit about your studio. I think I know a little bit about your personal system, but for the folks on the call, when you go home and listen to music, whatever that might be, what do you listen to? What type of equipment do you listen to it on?
Okay, it depends. If I'm just wanting to listen, like you just said, in my living room, I've got the Quad 57s with old name gear, and that's just simple as can be. It's Quad 57s, an old name amp and preamp, a medium cheap Audio Lab CD player, and a good DAC. I think I have a really good DAC out there, and I just listen to that, and I'm happy as can be. when we're eating, when I'm playing chess, when I'm reading. That's what I listen to. And because of the mid-range, just drives me crazy in a good way. Nothing's like a quad 57 mid-range.
No argument there.
Pardon?
No argument there.
Yeah, so they're limited, it's true, but I don't care. If you sit close to them and you've got a good setup, they're fabulous. When I'm in the studio listening, I listen over the hornings, and I have very revealing, not quite brutal equipment called Benchmark. I have a Benchmark amp and a Benchmark preamp, and they're the only amp and preamp of that kind that's just brutally revealing without being hard to listen to. They have incredible low noise. I hear everything. My favorite amp of all time so far has been this huge what was it called? A Wycliffe? Huge.
Ytech Labs?
Ytech, yeah, Ytech. 845, thing weighed a ton, unbelievable. But I couldn't hear every little thing on it, every single detail. And plus I couldn't leave the amp on all the time. And so I moved on. But beauty-wise, the Ytech was, oh my God, just stunning. But work-wise, these are the best for me, the Benchmark.
Great. I'm going to do a couple things here, hopefully not put you on the spot too much, but I picked out a few recordings that I purchased from you. I'll talk about them very briefly, and maybe if you want to, can remember the process or just recording the thing, if you can just talk about them as well. But I think one of the first recordings I got from you was Mike Garson, Monk Fell on Me.
Oh, yeah.
Recorded back in June of 2013 in Chicago, using two Neumann U67 microphones. So,
by the way, and Tony, by the way, that's an example of what this other person asked about microphones being appropriate for the instrument. We tested 5 or 6 different mics, and the U67 sounded the best.
Great. The recording is fantastic. I mean, it's amazing. And for those of you on the call who don't know Mike Garson, he's a pianist. He's had a long career, but most notably spent time working with David Bowie on the Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane, and I believe Diamond Dogs recordings. So he's been around in the jazz and rock field. Back around this time, when I acquired this tape, we were still doing audio shows down and predominantly down in LA. Mike was a guest performer at one of the shows. And I bumped into him in the lobby, and I ran up to him and said, "Hey, I know you're really busy, Mike, and you're getting ready for the show tonight, but if you ever have a chance, I've got my tape deck up in the room, and I have this recording you made with Jonathan Horwich back in Chicago." He goes, "Oh, really?" I said, "I've never listened to that recording." I said, "I made it, and I walked out of the studio, and I never listened to it." So he got to listen to it at that show, and I'll tell you what he said, and you can comment if you like, but he looked at me and he said, "Warm, analog." And that's what he said. He just kind of, like, the first time he actually ever heard that recording, and it's just him on solo piano doing a number of Thelonious Monk songs, and it's brilliant in its simplicity, if I might say. I mean, just his playing is brilliant. The recording is the miking is perfect, in my opinion, and just the sound is so realistic. Now, of course, having to play them on a pair of quad 57s, okay, but I've heard the recording on other speakers as well, and that I guess his comment, that analog sound of, you know, the piano, the wood, the striking of the notes, you know, with the mallet, it's just amazing. It's just a really simple but brilliant recording. So, for what that's worth. But you mentioned Greg Ward earlier. I've got a couple of I think you did a couple of his recordings. This one was from May of 2017. Recorded to an 8-track Rerock Studer tape deck, Neve RN-R1 microphones, ribbons on sax, and B&K 4006 on bass, and omnidirectional KMF tube mic on the piano. So I picked this one out because I think recently we had a conversation about a man named Ron Clearfield who played piano on that recording. And I saw a jazz show in San Francisco about 2 months ago now. where Ron was playing piano on with the band, and I bought one of his LPs and had him sign it, and found out that he had one time lived in Chicago, and asked him if he knew you, and he said, yeah, he did. And I kind of contacted you and said, yeah, he's on a couple of the recordings I made, and so I went and pulled it out, and there he is. So did you ever touch base with him? I know you were going to try to contact him.
He lives in France.
Yeah, he lives in Paris now. Yeah.
Yeah, not Paris. He's outside Paris.
Outside of Paris.
Yeah.
So that recording is Greg Ward Trio at Pro Musica. Anything you want to maybe tell us about that recording in general? Anything, how it was made, or the performance, or just in your opinion how it went?
Well, it went very smoothly, and Ron Clifford is a wonderful player on piano. I used what's called a ribbon mic on that one. And it came out beautifully on the alto. Well, it just went smoothly. That's all I can say, and Greg played, I thought, brilliantly. And that's a good example of him playing on the edge for a lot of people's taste. For mine, it's just nothing, but I'm so used to that. But he's pushing it, but he's just a brilliant player, and the group is fabulous. And if I remember, the bass sound on that is really good.
Yeah, it is. I actually, the bass on a lot of your recordings, I remember another one specifically, Jason Rabke.
Yeah, Justin
Robke. The song Shimmering.
Yeah.
Just really, the bass sounds just like the name of the song. I mean, just really kind of shimmering, just kind of really chilly in a way, but in a good way. Just really clear, really, really good recording of them. You also mentioned Richie Beirach, and I think this is up there with one of my favorite recordings, Rendezvous, which you made back in 1981, so an older recording. And you were using the Mark Levinson ML8s at that time, along with some other interesting equipment. I recorded it to a Studer Levinson ML5, and this is originally one of your 30 IPS recordings. So. Two Mark Levinson ML8s and then two omnidirectional Brühl and I don't know I can't really say the last word.
Brühl and K. B and K.
B and Ks. So another really good. I love the first song, The Last Rhapsody, really, and just Richie and George Mraz on bass. So just another one of your simple but brilliant sounding recordings. And this one is a direct copy of the master. I think the Greg Ward one was as well. I don't remember what the Mike Garson was. The Garson is just a production, I think.
It should have been direct.
Should have been? I'll have to check. Yeah. I can't reach it anymore. I tossed it over here.
Okay.
But yeah, that recording I just love too. I play that quite a bit, and play it for people when they want to. If I only have time to play in one tape, I usually play that tape. It's a really nice recording. But anything about that you want to maybe talk about in terms of either the recording or the sound that was captured, or just anything in general?
Well, the Beirach one I did in Tampa, if I remember, I can't remember where, I think it was at a big auditorium. And there was an example of just using two microphones. Yeah. And I put the two microphones between the piano and the bass player. So the bass player was facing the piano so they could see each other, and the mics were in between them.
It was Sarasota, actually, in what's called, I guess, Van Wezel Performing Arts Hall. So yeah, Sarasota back in 1981. So yeah, and then the last one here, this really interesting one I found, Gary Peacock and Chick Corea, Spontaneity, which, I mean, the title says it all, really. But back in 1979 at Delphian Foundation in Oregon, recorded onto a Stellavox Stellamaster SP8, probably one of the better decks out there. Oh no, that was the SM8, but the SP8.
The SP8.
Yeah, the B and K mics again, and Mark Levinson ML8s, and a 9-foot concert grand piano by Mark Allen, engineered of course by you. So that's one of those tapes where you can kind of hear some of the banter and some of the, chit chat between Gary and Chick Corea during and in between the tracks.
Yes.
A couple expletives in there after they were getting pretty excited about what they just performed. But really cool recording. I mean, if you have any more of those, I'd be interested, like not from that session, but any more of those kind of spontaneous recordings. I would really like those because they're really natural and just really two guys just kind of going at it and just working it together and coming up with some really cool stuff.
Exactly. Okay.
So anyway, just for everyone's information on those are some of my favorites of yours. Like I said, I've got plenty of them. The one you mentioned earlier, Dee Alexander, she's really good, a really good female vocalist, and really like that one that you put out with her. And then there's many other ones again that I often go back to and just pick one out one day, and just if I have time to really sit down and listen, I'll just pick out one of your tapes and go and hit it and enjoy it, usually with a little drink in my hand and just kind of relax. But anything of yours that kind of stands out that you really thought was a really good effort, really good production and something that you're really, proud of, over and above your other work?
Well, the ones you mentioned, the ones you mentioned for sure, Dee Alexander, John Wojciechowski, do you have that one?
I do, yeah.
I love that one. The recent guitar trio I just put out, I like.
That's an interesting one. Yeah, I've listened to it once. I need to go back and listen to it a couple more times. But yeah, that's an interesting one. The guitar is very interesting. Yeah.
And I love the guitar sound, and I like the bass a lot. The drummer is very soft, so he doesn't show up. I wish we had done something about that, but the bass on that is pretty serious on the trio, on the guitar trio. So that's a really good one.
Remind me, and for the benefit of the group, what miking were you using on that, and what kind of microphones were you using on that recording?
On the guitar?
Yeah, on the whole recording itself.
Yeah, it was, I got it right here. Why? I'm not going to tax my mind. I'll be right there. There we go. So it was, on the guitar was a pair of AKG 414s. It's kind of a famous mic. And on the bass, I used what's called an Earthworks SV33. It's a modern microphone, which I like a lot because it gets a lot of detail. When I do acoustic bass, I try to get as much detail as possible, because it already has a woolly sound. And on the drums, we used a pair of AKG 414s again. So it was very simple.
I guess that's kind of all I had. I mean, I'm sure I can think of a few more things, but I also want to leave some time for the folks on the line to talk to you and ask some questions. Anything else you want to add about, about your... Oh, I actually do have one more question. The phonograph and international phonograph, where did that really originate from? Because I really just know you from tape.
Because when we started, the first thing we did was the Richie Beirach on vinyl.
Aha. Okay.
When we started out, that's all we were going to do was vinyl. We never thought we'd put out tape.
And did you have your own lathe and everything and work to cut your own?
No.
No, okay. So
yeah. What's his name? We had it done by that famous, oh my God, what's his name? I'm getting old. Let me see if I've got it here. Anyway, it was done by somebody else.
Okay. But yeah, basically then, have you ever put out records? I mean, were you ever selling records at one time or just producing them for people?
Well, I didn't sell them as a vendor, no. As the manufacturer, yes.
Okay.
As the record company, we sold them to distributors, yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, it looks like somebody found one. Steve Schaefer. All right. Well, let's. If anybody on the line wants to unmute, you can unmute yourselves and talk to Jonathan.
I'll be brave enough to ask a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was just reading a review. I have a favorite singer. I've talked about him on our Friday night socials before, UC Bjorling, and he was recording late 20s, a lot in the 30s and 40s, and in the 50s, he switched from making his recordings on wax to making them on tape. He had a contract with RCA, and people complained that he sounded harsh in the upper register on tape, and the tapes had a dry and metallic sound. And I'm wondering if you know anything about wax and what could account for such a difference in the quality of his voice in the two recording mediums. And why would the tape have sounded harsh? Well, couldn't you adjust it so that it didn't?
Well, I have no clue what could have caused that. No idea. And I suspect it's not the tape. I suspect it's something else in the tape path. And then it was recorded onto the tape harsh.
We're talking about the recording end or the listening end? You're talking about the recording end?
Recording end.
Yeah. Well, I'm just curious. I don't really know what I'm talking about. I just read somebody commenting about the different qualities, and I assume the recording engineer has a lot of power, and I was surprised that he would allow something to sound harsh.
He may not have heard it. Yeah, I don't know what that was.
All right.
All right.
Any other questions for Jonathan?
Yeah, I guess I have a quick question, Larry. And Jonathan, so what's your view on the perspective from the person listening? Let's say it's a natural recording, a little bit closer with more detail, or a little further back perspective. So like if there was a piano, there's some recordings where the person producing is really interested in hearing the person who's playing it back hears a lot of the action of the instrument, where others, you have a further back perspective where you don't hear as much of that. And, what's your feeling about that, or what type of perspective do you go for for the listener of your tapes?
It's a very good question and very hard to answer. My perspective has changed over the years. When I was younger, I preferred it farther back, like the Richie Beirach, Corea thing. And in fact, when I recorded the Mike Garson, I was afraid it was too close. We did that on purpose because the studio was just being put together that we were in, and we didn't want to get any studio sound into the Mike Garson recording. We were really right over the strings. And I was really worried about that, and eventually came to love the recording. So my taste has changed where I'm more tolerant of a close-up perspective, even though when you're in a club, you don't sit there with your head in the piano. So I've over the years gotten, as long as there's a feeling of space around the instrument, I'm okay. What I don't like is when you get so close up that it sounds like it's a steam locomotive going through your living room and there's no space around it. It's just this big giant thing and you've stuck your head in it. So I like a little bit of space. For instance, the Greg Ward Trio has a real nice sense of space in it, yet it gets enough detail to be palatable. He doesn't sound like he's in the living room somewhere away from you. So I've changed over the years. I like it closer than I used to, but not so close that it's totally unnatural. Hard question, though.
Thanks a lot. That was helpful.
So I have a question about, you were talking earlier about the difference in sound at different recording speeds. Just kind of curious if you noticed a difference in the bass response at different speeds. I remember reading, at least in consumer decks, that the higher the speed, the higher the low-end cutoff frequency was tape head resonance. Is that a thing with professional machines, or did you ever notice the difference?
Yes, there is. At 30, you get, the bass is not quite as good at 15. And at 7.5, it's supposedly a little better. Wow. That's just a phenomenon. It's sort of a known thing. That's why some people don't do 30, even though 30 is more open and 30 has a sound to it. It's just gorgeous, but you don't get as much bass either.
Could that be part of the reason you like the 7.5 IPS?
It might be. I was so shocked. I still can't get over it. And it might be that it gives it a more solid foundation. I cannot understand it. I still don't get it. It was just as good as 15, if not better. It was gorgeous. I had to because I had a broken switch on my Studer and it wouldn't switch to 15. And I was stuck. I was at the session. So I recorded at 7.5 thinking, oh my God, this is a disaster. It sounded so good. And my friend agreed. He said, it sounds fabulous. And it did. And I put it out and it sounds fabulous. Nobody even knows what it is. Well, I may have said what it is. Do you know the Joe Policastro Vibes Quartet? Mm-hmm. That's one of the best ones I did. That was 7.5.
Wow. Okay, I've got
that. Gorgeous.
Yep. Interesting.
So that,
go back and pick that one out and listen to it again.
Yeah. So that's my take.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So I have a question about, I guess you'd say, state of the art. And what I wonder, I asked this question at the last time we all met when Freemer was there, and it was very disruptive, and I think I pissed him off. But why is it that I can listen to a recording maybe that was made in '59, and you've given lots of examples of artists that recorded back then, and we've got, you know, excellent recordings of, and then you go into the 60s and 70s and even closer in time, and the recording is not as good. What's wrong with that? Why aren't we getting nothing but better and better all the time?
Okay, well, I won't address that, but I will tell you, only because I don't know how much of that holds. I'd have to carefully listen. Like, I think there's some brilliant recording engineers. The trouble is, what you might be hearing is that the earlier back you go, or the farther back you go, the simpler was the setup and the equipment. Like the Sonny Rollins that I love, Way Out West, is very simple stuff. And it's also tube microphones, which are gorgeous sounding, and you don't get any artifacts with them. So many of the solid state up until very recently were terrible microphones. And your ear may be, just like Tony and I have a certain sensitivity, whereas so that we love quad mid-range, we just have a sensitivity to that. Other people could care less about the quad and think, big deal. To me, it's like captivating, and your ear may be sensitive to these artifacts that came later, which were more microphones, more equipment, more processing of the sound, which didn't necessarily lead to better sound, and in many cases did not. And that's probably what's happening. Your ear is sensitive to the fact that they've gotten more complex, microphones aren't as good, etc.
Do you think that could be possible with Beatles recordings? Because I really don't like them. I'm a great fan, but when I look at other rock bands in the same time period, the recordings are superior to theirs, and you'd think that they would have the best of everything.
Well, that's not a stupid comment. That's very astute, because they picked the producer and the studio they picked, and that's what the sound is going to be determined by. I've heard the Beatles. I love the Beatles, but not knowledgeably. And I've never heard one that sounded that good to me. I just thought it was because that's the way it was. And that's the way it probably is.
Wasn't that a period when they were transitioning, a lot of the groups were transitioning from monophonic to stereo, and the monophonic sounds were always hands down better, whether it was the Rolling Stones, the Beatles. I mean, there was, even the Beach Boys, I mean, they just sounded better. And, there was too much separation in the stereo because people were trying to dazzle each other with separation. And so it was phony.
Yeah. And chances, anyway, the answer to the question is that the Beatles picked who they picked, and that was the studio they picked, and the guy's no dummy that they picked. but that sound may not be your sound. I personally have not heard a Beatles record where I go, oh my God, the sound, like Pink Floyd. That's a beautiful recording. It's not natural, but it's gorgeous, well done. That to me sounds beautiful. The Beatles stuff does not sound beautiful to me, but I haven't listened to a lot of it, so I really have no right to speak. But I can understand.
I have all the way back to the monaural and the stereo, and I brought this up with Freemer, and he had worked on a remastering of the White Album, so I went out and bought that, and still my opinion's the same. I mean, I'm to the point that I'd if it were up to me, George Martin would lose his knighthood over this, but yeah, and I've heard others like I've heard others like that Steve talked about that were in monaural compared to stereo, and you really hear a huge difference. But in the Beatles, I don't even like the monaural.
Well, and the Beatles weren't the Beatles recorded for AM radio? I mean, they were made to sound good on the AM radio. I don't think they were made to be high fidelity.
Well, I think you could say that about everybody, but that's my point, is though that there are things that were done way back. I mean, I think the example I used in the last time we were together was just Patsy Cline, and I think you hit on it. You answered it. It was just very simple, but man, when you listen to the bass in that, you can hear the hand sliding up and down on the bass, and you don't hear anything like that on a Beatles album. So I think you've hit it right. It's the recording studio and what they did, and they did it consistently, and it wasn't very good. It's unfortunate.
There are modern recordings that are done well too, though.
Oh yeah, I agree. I didn't mean to say that. I mean, what I just was, you would think if you can do Patsy Cline, for God's sakes, in 1959, great, you could do the Beatles in 69.
It also depends on the venue, the producer, the engineer. I mean, the stuff that Leonard Chess was doing, the stuff that Buddy Holly was doing, where he was controlling most of what was happening. That stuff sounds great today. If you've got a good master and you play it back, it sounds wonderful.
Go listen to the Carpenters. Go listen to the Carpenters.
Yeah.
Well, that's synthetic as far as I'm concerned. But
no, Stephen, that's another good example. Buddy Holly and others like that. But maybe
I even go back to the Zombies. For some reason, they were recorded well.
Yeah.
So you never know.
Yeah, I think you're just hearing the style and quality of that particular producer, recording engineer, studio.
Right. Yeah.
And do remember, as time went on, things got more and more complex, which is what I was saying earlier. I'm not saying I'm in the category of these guys, but I try to keep things as simple as possible, so you get a natural, like bass. I obsess over bass because it's so hard to do right. It's just a bear to get bass right. And I obsess over, and I try to get that sound where it sounds like the bass is in its own space with a real natural sound to the string. But you're just hearing something that happened, and that's the way it is.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate.
Hey, John, I have a question for you.
Most of Miles Davis's stuff is disgusting. They just ruined it. I mean, he did a record called Miles Smiles.
Yeah.
It's really even though most audiophiles don't know about it, it's a watershed moment in jazz in terms of sort of bridging avant and standard playing, and it's recorded terribly.
Yeah.
Most of his things, the best one that I've heard is, besides Cafe Blue, is the one he did live in 1964 called My Funny Valentine. It's a live recording with it's a NAACP concert called My Funny Valentine. It has a picture of him on the cover. He's there. It's just very natural. They're live, and whoever recorded it was good. But his studio stuff, most of it's terrible. most of it, not all of it. The Columbia, you know, the kind of blue is gorgeous.
Wasn't there also in later recordings more compression added to a lot of recordings?
More everything.
Yeah.
Jonathan, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I too like electrostatic speakers. As a matter of fact, I do use them. And several of I have CDs that have been converted from 30 IPS discs have just a wonderful, gorgeous mid-range to upper level. And you say that you don't get the bass response that you do at 7.5. Is there anything you can do with miking that would cure that?
Yes, that's a good question. First of all, I don't like electrostatics, by the way, just for the record.
Oh, well, I do.
I don't. I love the Quad 57s, but the other electrostatics don't sound, they sound, it doesn't mean they haven't in the last 10 years improved, but up until 5 or 10 years ago, they sounded synthetic to me. That's just me. I'm not saying that as a stance. I'm just saying I love the Quad 57s, and generally I'm not an electrostatic person. But yes, the answer is you can move the microphone closer. There's ways to do that, yes. And there's some microphones that adapt themselves to more bass. So the answer to that is yes. You can compensate a bit.
Thank you. But I'll keep my electrostats.
Pardon me?
I'm going to keep my electrostats.
Oh, please do. I'm sure they're great. I'm just not a lover. I don't even know them anymore, what they are. You know, the companies.
We're getting close to the end. Anybody else want to have a question for Jonathan or have a comment?
Hi there.
I just would like a beer.
Well, I think John Curl wants to say something, so let's give John.
Hey guys, yeah, I'd like to point out about 30 versus 15 and all that. It's a known phenomenon. You know, I used to design tape recorders for Ampex and custom as well, and I used to run 30 as well. I love 30, but the problem with 30 is the tape head bump and the roll off, and it is a difficult problem that mostly has not been well, let's say, engineered out, but it can be engineered out by EQ in the tape recording reproduce process, but it takes a special kind of EQ and not just an equalizer to do it properly. But it can be done. And I did it for Mobile Fidelity once, twice, and then I did it for Wilson Audio. But it requires a special technique and actually an extra stage of preamplification, you might say, which has a special kind of equalizer in it, which has to be mapped to the exact heads and the wrap of the machine that you have. In other words, the machine, you almost have to take a frequency response in advance and then, create the EQ, a slope, but to get it absolutely right. But it can be done. But 30 is always rolling off. I mean, but if you can get anything below 30, 30 inches at 30 inches per second, if you can get 30 hertz, you're lucky. You know, and it's the width of the head that causes the problem. In other words, real skinny inline kind of reproduced heads roll off quicker than fat, wide reproduced heads. And the movie industry used to know this many years ago when they were doing the recordings, and they would make these heads that were extra wide, and they would work pretty well. But the standard heads in normal machines, they want to put 3 or 4 heads in a stack and all that. And some people wanted the slimline series, you might say, of reproduce head, and that was the worst of all. So just to point that out, it can be fixed. But of course, your proximity effect and your directional microphones, that'll do it. Just like Jonathan said. And you could theoretically best fit it with your ear. Because what else can you do, Unless you really know the stuff, you have to measure the stuff. And my one problem, as I said, it's the matter of how much tension you have on the tape machine. Let's say you have a Studer. I used to use Studers for this. And when you have a Studer and let's say the tension is not quite right, then the wrap angle will be slightly different. And it'll throw that EQ that can be very, very precisely done, you know, at one point, it'll throw it completely off. And then you get too much bass or too little bass at different frequencies. So anyway, that's the thing, guys. It's not a big mystery. And you know, the other thing I want to mention is you were talking about why in the 60s or the 50s it sounded so good and then it didn't. Guess what? Design engineers were switching to digital. I mean, not to digital. No, I take it back. To analog solid state. And the hip thing was solid state. And solid state sucked. Guys, I'm saying, you know, you ought to know that by now. Back in the day, when they switched over to solid state, they did not know what they were doing. And today we've done a lot better. But for years and years, the tube stuff always sounded better. And everybody knew it. At Ampex, we knew it. You know, but we had to make the solid state because that's all that would sell.
Hey, thanks, John.
Is this the real John Curl?
Yeah,
it's the real John Curl.
Holy shit!
Yeah, I'm still here, man. You too,
John. Did you know Dean Romanis? No,
I don't think so. Who was that?
He worked at Mark Levinson probably just after you designed something for Mark. He was sort of and then he and I started my company together, International Phonograph Incorporated together. He worked for Dean worked for Mark Levinson, and then when Mark imploded or exploded, yes, he went to Krell.
Well, good for him. I didn't know the guy. I used to know Angelo replaced me. Mark and I had a big falling out. He decided not to pay me at one point, and that's when that falling out occurred back in 76. And since that, then I was, but whoever worked on the Mark Levinson recordings, the recorders, that guy was, you know, I mean, that was partly my old modules that I designed for Mark, but at the same time, they were implemented in the right way. That's the kind of improved, that's when we started to improve the solid state sound.
Yes.
With the Mark Levinson modules. You know, first for home and then for the master recorder that you used. It was ML8, you said?
ML5. Yeah,
ML5, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
yeah, ML5. I didn't work on it. I wasn't given any credit for it, but I was working in Switzerland at the time with on Studers, modifying Studers myself. So years later, after all this, I started throwing away the Studer electronics, actually building my own, and for Mobile Fidelity and for Wilson Audio. But the Studer transports are wonderful. And the heads aren't half bad.
Yeah, they're very good. And they record okay. The playback is where they really.
It's the playback. Oh yeah, it's the playback. It's awful. It's what version of Studer do you have for playback?
Well, I don't. Well, I do. I have an 810, but I play it back through Doshi Electronics.
Aha. Yeah. I understand. No, I used to have an A80 Mark II or Mark III. The Mark III had a Class C amplifier. Can you imagine? It had a dead zone built into the reproduce electronics. Crossover distortion, man. I tell you, I measured it and showed Willie Studer himself, and they just got mad at me instead of fixing it. But your engineers know. We all know when you listen long enough, you know what the problems are. But the design engineers often don't listen. You know, at the factory, they don't know. They just make some measurements under certain conditions to say, well, it passed muster, the heck with it. That is the problem, which we've had for many years. Okay, guys.
I have a question. Can I?
Good, Laurie.
Is there a place in recording music for binaural recording? I'm a huge fan of binaural recordings, and is there any kind of high-end music recording that they would be appropriate for, like for headphone listening specifically?
Well, if I understand your question, I don't do that. but it can be done for, some people do it, and it can be done for piano. You know, I'm just not familiar enough with how they do it, how to do it.
Okay.
But they're great. I hear they're great for headphone listening.
Mm-hmm.
Is music surprised someone doesn't specialize in it.
Do any engineers record with headphones in mind? Is there any kind of specificity in that sort of market?
Yeah, some engineers do. Absolutely. I don't, but some engineers do. I just make it as natural as I can, or as good as I can, and hope it works for headphones and speakers. But some people are very aware of that.
Chesky Recordings has done some binaural. So you can look up the Chesky recordings. They have a big catalog, and they're good. Yeah, they're really good. But I know they've done a few specifically for headphone listening. So,
cool.
From what I understood, the reason why they're good for headphones is the miking was spaced out according to your ears. Now, of course, I believe that technology started out in Germany, so there were like German heads and German ears. You know? So, but I used to go to some places where we could record shows in clubs, and I would always see a guy with a fake head and the microphones on either ear making a binaural recording, and he would make them for his headphone listening. So they were really, I think, optimal for headphones for sure. Although I know that there's a Lou Reed live recording called "Take No Prisoners" that is done in binaural. In fact, a number of Lou Reed, I think Lou Reed was into the binaural recordings for a while. He had a German producer, I believe, at the time. And on that live recording, though, you could really kind of hear the sound collapse. And it did sound like on your speakers, you're listening through a pair of headphones. It was kind of an interesting phenomena. I don't know if I liked it a lot, but you know, that wasn't a really well recorded live show anyway. So I didn't really give it much mind. I just turned it up really loud and, you know, all right, great, Sweet Jane, let's go, you know, whatever. You know? So I wasn't listening to quads at that time. So I didn't care how loud I was playing my music or whatever. I don't even remember. I think there were Infinity speakers back then, but anyway, doesn't matter. But I think, Lori, for your, if you listen to binaural recordings through headphones, you'll get a lot more satisfaction, in my opinion.
Much more. And by the way, one thing I wanted to say about what John Kroll said, and somebody earlier asked, transistor solid state equipment was horrible when it first came out, like digital was. I mean, digital has come so far from where it was. But Mark Levinson got famous because John Kroll designed a good solid state preamp, which at that time there was a big movement to tubes in the audiophile world. Absolute Sound and things like that, audio research company. And John Kroll designed this preamp for Mark Levinson, which put him on the map because it sounded pretty good and it was transistor. And what he was saying, what John was saying was that transistors and solid state did not sound good for a long time, which was a big problem and did ruin a lot of sound.
Yeah, I wonder if that's a problem with early Beatles records, if they used early transistor electronics in the studio.
Say that again.
So I wonder if that was maybe a problem with the sound of early Beatles music, if they used early transistor stuff in the studio in the 60s.
Could have been.
Was it less expensive, solid state?
And you didn't have to worry about tubes burning out and the heat.
There you go. It's always about money.
Well, I can comment on the early Beatles. Those were on tube recorders, tube microphones, and tube mixing consoles even, till about the 66 or so.
Okay, that answers that. Thank you.
No, I think, yeah, guys, it was. The Beatles used vacuum tubes mostly. When they were in a professional recording studio, they used the vacuum tube electronics. It's pretty darn good. That was pretty darn good and was considered special. In fact, I know one guy that I used to work for actually bought one of the original consoles off of, from that did record the Beatles. And it was definitely all vacuum tube. And, it was hard to switch over from vacuum tube to solid state. Again, the old problem of what people were trying to build. The engineers are building to measurement and not to listen. They weren't listening to what they were doing. And it took, that's what I had a, you know, I had the same problem before I met Mark. We would have to use, at a hi-fi dealer, we'd have to use vacuum tube electronics to play back the speakers properly. In other words, you couldn't use the solid state electronics at the time, the early 70s. It sounded awful. So they would actually bring in old Marantz tube stuff to sound, you know, to make the sound good enough so that the customer would hear the speakers properly. You know, whatever speaker it was, whether it was a quad or whether it was a Clipshorn or whether it was whatever it was. So anyway, that's the deal, guys. You know, solid state was really crude in the early days, and there were reasons for it. But I won't go into. I can't go into that, of course, with you now. But we fixed most of that. So, but I love tubes. I still do. I think they sound great. And I cannot compete directly with tubes on every plane. Cannot do it. What my thing I want to ask you, Jonathan, am I still around? Am I talking?
You are talking, John.
Yeah. Okay. I can't hear myself. So, Jonathan, what do you think about tube Neumann electronics versus solid state Neumann electronics? In their back and in the microphone itself.
If you're talking about Neumann against Neumann, I'm not qualified. If you're talking about, first of all, the good Neumann mics, tube mics are incredible. The U67, I have the 254s. They're amazing. I will say the current solid state equipment is getting better and better and better. And it's quite competitive. You're getting into real subtleties now, you know, differences, just like the best solid state electronics today are really good against the best tube. It's really a matter of taste and which priority do you have. And that's true, you know, that's true of the current microphones. The solid state microphones are really good.
Well, what kind of width of microphone do you like to use? Do you like to use half-inch like the B&Ks, or do you like to use 3/4 or 1-inch mics like the Neumanns or Sheps?
Oh, yeah.
What do you prefer? Is there anything you prefer?
I prefer the Neumann tube, either, you know, the 254s, which are pencil mics, kinda, you know, pencil mics, and the U67, which I'm sure you know. And there's another mic I adore, which are handmade current mic, tube mics, but they're custom, made for me by a friend in San Diego. And there's a stereo tube mic that's just unbelievable. So it depends on what I want to mic and what I'm doing it for. The solid state AKG 414s are really good. They're not tube, and they're very good. The old ones.
Now, are those RF mics? You know what I'm talking about with RF? FM?
No, I don't think they are.
Okay.
I don't know though.
Okay, fair enough.
But they're very good. The Sheps to me were, you know, I haven't heard Sheps recently, but in the old days, Mark Levinson used to use Sheps, and I found them a little bit hard.
Huh, good, interesting.
No, I don't think they are anymore. But they used to be.
Hey guys,
Sure.
It looks like we've gone over time here, which is great, and some really appreciative of the discussion, especially with John and John Curl and Jonathan Horwich. Jonathan, thank you so much for your time. It was enlightening. Sure. I appreciate it. It really, I think, helps us get an understanding of what goes on in that studio and how we get to hear some really great recordings, not just by yourself, but by other great engineers out there. And there are quite a few, as you had mentioned, and quite a few, even today, quite a few really good recordings out there. We are going to, obviously we tape this. When the tape is ready to go on our site, we'll send you a copy in the email as well. Feel free to point people here. And obviously, as you put out your emails for your new recordings, you can certainly link that out over to us as well. Larry Denniston, anything you want to add to close out?
No, not really. I really appreciate your time and great discussion. It was very, very good.
May I ask one last question I forgot about to Jonathan, because he's the only guy who can tell me. Jonathan, what about the ribbon mics? Where do they fit in all this sonically? Ribbon mics? Yeah, like the RCAs or whatever you use today.
Well, they're beautiful. Sometimes they sound a little, how do you say, reserved for my taste. So that's why I usually don't use them. They're also a little more delicate, but they're beautiful. I used a gorgeous Neve makes a ribbon mic, and I used it on that recording of Greg Ward, Tony. That's a Neve ribbon mic, and it was gorgeous. And that one did have a high end a bit. The only reason that most ribbon mics sound a little dull to me.
Maybe that's why they're popular for horn recording.
Yes, exactly.
They warm up the horns.
Exactly.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and appreciate the participation again. Larry, if there's anything else you have to add, we can call it a take.
No, I think it was great. Thanks. Thanks, Tony.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks, guys.